Thanks for joining us today. My name is Chase Huntley. I direct energy and climate work at the Wilderness Society based in Washington, D.C. Today, we're going to take a deeper look into the recent experience of the United States in tackling supply-side solutions. Michael did a great job setting us up yesterday in his introductory remarks when he walked through the arc of the supply-side conversation, particularly in the United States. Despite its current posture, at least at the national level, the U.S. can offer a lot of lessons on the practical challenges facing those who want to tackle these issues, particularly with regard to the calculus decision makers face in setting and implementing agendas, the uncertainty about the distributional impacts of supply policies, the obstacles to implementing agencies who want to move forward with supply-side policies, given the body of law that they have to work with. On today's panel, we have a number of experts from a variety of disciplines, and it'll give us a chance to look more deeply into how these policy ideas came together in the U.S., from deciding on Keystone XL for climate reasons to discussing how to calling for a moratorium on coal leasing on public lands. And it'll let us touch down on how the national conversation has shifted to a decision that's still pending before California Governor Brown. A couple of pieces of context, though, that are important for this conversation. Today's panel is going to spend a lot of time talking about U.S. public lands. It's a very large knob that could be turned quickly. The management authority and discretion that the U.S. federal government wields in overseeing the leasing, permitting, and development of U.S.-owned public energy assets is significant. But these lands are to be managed for multiple uses. And though that concept has many interpretations in practice, the government has a duty to manage for other factors, including biodiversity, other energy uses like renewable energy, other economic uses, including recreation, which is one of the fastest growing sectors in the U.S. economy. These lands draw a lot of attention because of the sheer scope of opportunity to address climate change. The U.S. government manages 570 million acres of coal, 570 million acres of fluid minerals onshore, and more than 1 billion acres of fluid minerals offshore. That means the U.S. government occupies a significant role in domestic energy production, producing 13% of the gas, 17% of the oil, and 40% of the coal in the United States. For contrast, less than 1% of permitted nameplate capacity of wind, solar, and geothermal are found on public lands, so more work to do there. But the fossil energy resources pulled out of public lands and waters have a huge emissions footprint. The life cycle carbon emissions associated with production in 2017 alone resulted in an estimated 1.3 million tons of CO2 equivalent. That's about 20% of total U.S. emissions. And there's a lot left. Recent studies have shown that reserves that aren't leased contain nearly 450 billion tons of carbon. So despite this multiple use mandate, these lands have traditionally been managed for fossil energy exploitation, reaching back to the early part of the 20th century. That's found embedded in the culture of the agencies responsible for overseeing their use, the leases and the permitting structures, including especially fee recovery systems. They're all wildly biased toward fossil energy. And that history has led to a high degree of carbon entanglement amongst states where the production occurs. The 10 states most reliant on fossil energy revenue draw nearly 15% of their revenues on average from fossil energy production, with states like Wyoming and Alaska drawing more than 20%. And unfortunately, most of that goes to pay for social services, including education. So that's enough from me. Let's let the panelists now pull back the curtain on the U.S. system and draw forward some lessons. We'll start with Ali Zaidi, who is an energy scholar at Stanford University and formerly a senior official in the Obama administration. He's going to provide some insights into the decision-making logic behind closed doors over the administration's 8 years. Next, we'll have Jayni Hein, who is directing the Institute for Policy Integrity at New York University's Law School. She's going to look at the solutions proposed to capture carbon externalities in federal revenue collection. And then we'll have Florian Egli, a doctoral student in Zurich focused on clean energy. He's going to talk about his work examining political repercussions of declining coal production in Appalachia. And then we'll close with Kassie Siegel, who directs the Climate Law Institute for the Center for Biological Diversity. And she's going to assert several legal theories available to future presidential administrations and more immediately to Governor Brown. So Ali, you want to go first?
So I think I'm disappointing my Stanford colleagues because I have no slides, and that's certainly in vogue there. But first, I want to start sort of very narrow and talk about the decision-making process around coal in the federal government. So Chase talked about how the U.S. government's responsible for leasing about 40% of production, and that's obviously a big player in the market, and that was something that the previous administration wrestled with. So I want to start there. But then I want to walk back a little bit and take a broader view on the struggles around supply side policy that at least I saw during my 8 years working in the Obama administration. And then think about how do you sort of take some of the anxieties associated with approaching policy in that way and maybe start to work around those issues. So for federal coal leasing, I want you to sort of think about, so we sometimes say balance scale as the image of how you figure out the weight of something, but balance and scale are actually two different things. Scale is to figure out your sort of objective weight, and a balance, as one might, as the word might suggest, helps you figure out relative weight. So problem number one in figuring out how to reform the coal program was that the statute that governs the coal program establishes a balance in terms of how you set the royalty rather than a scale. And the balance is set to the fair market value, or the market value for the product that's being leased. And that would be a fine algorithm for a statute to articulate, except for the fact that by virtue of being such a large participant in the market, it's the sort of equivalent of, I like to create the image, our coal leasing program, you sort of think about it as like an elephant standing on one side of the balance with like one leg on the other side of the fulcrum manipulating the other side of the scale. And so all of a sudden your ability to use that algorithm articulated by the statute becomes a little defunct, because you're having such an influence on the other side, on the fair market value side, that you're not able to really output a very easy and usable number. So that was sort of problem number one, just the statutory complexity or the statutory ambiguity wrapped up in a market complexity. The second is just the broader data challenges. So as we went down the process of evaluating the coal program, we realized there are just a lot of things we didn't know about the coal program, including how federal leasing stacked up to private leasing, and how the different royalties were being calculated in reality. So the federal system really sets up a number of exemptions and loopholes, and when we did not have a great accounting on net of what the impact was, or really a good sense of what the throughput was leading to. One of the big questions, and one of the panels earlier sort of talked about the appetite for coal in Asia. Well, one of the big questions we wrestled with is how much of this coal is being consumed here, how much is it being consumed elsewhere, and not really great data to help support that decision-making process. The sort of third big challenge was, when you're articulating new policy around management of federal resources, and you've got a program that takes about 10 years from start to finish, from lease to permit to production, where do you draw the line? How do you think about the reliance interest borne up not just by the permittees or would-be permittees, but as Chase talked about, a lot of the revenues here are wrapped up in social services. How do you think about the systems that might get displaced in communities and the reliance interest there? And the last thing, having spent a bunch of time on regulatory policy on the demand side, in the US, co-benefits and the quantification of co-benefits is a significant driver for policy on the federal side. So our regulations around mercury in air really were a big driver for regulation that had significant capex implications for the power plant fleet. But a lot of the benefit justification actually came from co-benefits. And so one of the things we struggled with was, how do you think about the cost-benefit analysis? One of the things we don't really have good data on, or a way to really quantify and think about, is the impact on local environmental quality, local infrastructure, and how do you wrap that up into the decision making? So that's sort of the complexity of that one problem. But I think the coal situation is relatively unique even within federal leasing because of the significant role the federal government plays, and the difference on the oil and gas side in terms of the liquidity of the rest of and the substitution from the rest of the market. The broader question I think we often asked ourselves is, how do you arrange for success in a multi-level game? So we're talking about not decarbonization of one thing, but decarbonization of supply chains, right? So you're trying to control at a bunch of different levels and lead to a decarbonization outcome. And I think the dominant theory through most of the Obama administration was that if you built sort of a big enough magnet at one end of the supply chain, you could get the incentives to line up throughout, and you would have success at a multi-level game. So you built a strong enough policy on the demand side that would actually cascade in a way that was neat, the incentive through the system. But there's a complexity to that, and the complexity is, wherever you put that magnet, from a political economy perspective, the size of that magnet is probably going to be limited. If you scatter the magnet through the system, maybe that's not the most economically efficient thing, but maybe by scattering the magnets through the system, you're actually able to keep the perception of the policy footprint right-sized, rather than a really large magnet one place, which may skew the perception of the policy footprint. Hopefully you can see what I'm seeing in my brain. Maybe one day I will turn that into a really beautiful slide. So the big challenge as we think about supply chains and decarbonization of supply chains is, how do you work through the sort of second and third moves when you're playing that multi-level game? And on the supply side, I think one of the big challenges we always faced was, what does that second move or third move look like? How much sort of isostasy is there on the supply side? And how much are we just going to sort of not feel the full benefit? So I'll close just with one approach that we had thought about and actually proposed to Congress, and that was sort of the concept of a fee bait, not spelled out in that way, but we said, look, we'll lease a bunch more offshore, but we're going to make it so that the sort of freight of that is paying for research and development to innovate on demand side solutions. The flaw, there may be a lot of flaws in that policy, but principally that it didn't gain the votes to succeed. But one of the big flaws there is you have different actors on both sides of the policy, so you sort of miss that alignment opportunity. So I want to sort of just close out the opening remarks here with two images that hopefully you'll carry away. One is the image of why the coal program is so hard to reform, and that's an elephant on a scale, a balancing scale, with weight on both sides of the fulcrum, and how complicated it gets when the federal government's that big of a player. And then the second image is just thinking about magnets in a supply chain, where you place them, how you achieve consistency and alignment and incentives, and how do you make sure that the pull is felt appropriately and in a way that's distributionally reasonable and beneficial from not just the fundamental fairness questions, but from a political economy perspective.
So I'm here today to share the perspective of someone who was sort of working from the outside at an academic think tank, trying to assist the Department of the Interior, especially at the tail end of the Obama administration, in thinking about how it could reform its federal fossil fuel leasing policies. So I'm mainly going to talk about some work that I did that is captured in this law review article. And so if you are curious about the details, that's the citation, and you can find it there. But the key takeaways really that I have in this article and for you today are that the Department of the Interior really does have a broad statutory mandate under existing federal law to account for environmental and social values in a much more robust and even-handed manner than it has ever done in the past. I specifically hone in on fiscal reform and what Interior can do with royalty rates and other fiscal levers, and show that this can actually achieve some significant climate improvements, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and also some revenue benefits that flow directly back to the federal government as well as to states and communities where that production occurs. And this is especially valuable in our current situation in the United States, where legislative solutions are not forthcoming. In one of the earlier sessions, someone mentioned the long lag time between when you submit an article and when it is actually published. I think this is certainly evident here. A lot of the ideas here reflect the thinking that I did in 2016. It took over a year for the article to come out. And I certainly thought we would have a different administration now that might run with these potential reforms. We have a very different Department of the Interior today. And if you're curious, perhaps in the question and answer session, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that. But suffice it to say, I hope that the ideas I present here can be taken seriously by the next administration, by states in the United States that lease their own fossil fuels and set their own fiscal policies, and to other countries that have the authority to set different royalty rates and can really make some changes in climate policy in that way. So to just give you a very brief overview of how this works, Interior sets fiscal terms for fossil fuel leases on public lands, and it's leasing these lands to private energy developers for production. There are three main fiscal terms: minimum bids, rents, and royalties. By far, the greatest share of federal revenue and state revenue are the royalties. So I focus a lot of my time and attention there. Now, these fiscal terms, in some cases, have never been updated. The royalty rate for onshore oil, gas, and coal was set in 1920 with the passage of the Mineral Leasing Act, and it's still in effect today. Others have been changed only a very minor amount, and much has been written by myself and others about the minimum bid for oil and gas being $2 an acre, less than a cup of coffee costs in New York City, where I live, or really anywhere that I know of in the United States. So there's certainly room for improvement here, just in terms of fair market value. But the other thing that is missing, and really has always been missing, is that none of these fiscal terms take into account the externality costs of federal fossil fuel production. So in 1920, Interior certainly didn't know that fossil fuel production would contribute to climate change. But today, the science is clear, and we also have economic tools that allow it to actually measure those externality costs and force producers to internalize some of that cost directly. I'm specifically talking here about the social cost of carbon and the social cost of methane. And I know that these values are also used in other places in the EU. In the United States, the values that we use and that the Obama administration used were prepared by an interagency working group based on peer-reviewed science and literature, and it's a global value representing global damages. Now, I mentioned that to date, Interior has not done anything with these economic tools. At the tail end of the Obama administration, it was thinking about how to use these tools. And one of the things that I took a close look at is Interior's existing statutory discretion to account for these climate change costs in a robust way. So under 3 main statutes, Interior has really broad discretion to account for these environmental and social values. So the Mineral Leasing Act, it actually directs Interior to set fiscal terms in order to safeguard the public welfare. The Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976 talks about the multiple use mandate that Chase described. It talks about environmental and scenic values, and it lays out that fair market value requirement. And finally, offshore, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act talks about a required balance among environmental, social, and economic values. Now, Interior also has a direct incentive to actually manage public lands to account for climate externality costs. And one reason is that it's actually experiencing a lot of these costs itself. Wildfire seasons are increasingly costly and long. There's reduced snowpack, drought, all on our public lands. And so unlike a private actor, which may not have as much of an incentive to do something about this, Interior actually has these substantial land holdings which are directly affected today. So as a result, Interior's statutory mandate really can and should be envisioned to maximize the net benefits to the public from federal fossil fuel leasing. How would Interior do this? Well, I think the starting place would be to lay out a programmatic environmental review process, as it actually had started to do in 2016. And as part of that process, it would evaluate alternatives to the way that it currently leases federal fossil fuels. And one of the specific reforms that I suggest is looking at higher royalty rate alternatives, including some that would apply a carbon adder based on the costs of that fossil fuel production and consumption. And I'm going to describe 1 or 2 case studies that looked at specifically a coal consumption adder. Other alternatives that it should evaluate would be a declining production cap. So Chase and some other folks have done work looking at what would a carbon budget for public lands look like? How would we set that budget to help meet Paris goals, for example? And then, of course, as Kassie is going to talk about, Interior needs to evaluate the alternative of no new leasing and no extensions or expansions of existing leases. That's absolutely an essential policy to evaluate as well. So in this analysis, Interior should then evaluate what would the net effects of these policies be. So what would we see in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of revenue, in terms of overall net effects. It can use sophisticated models to do this analysis. EPA has these models, Interior has these models, and it should do energy substitution analysis. So I'm not going to discuss this study in detail for a few reasons, but one study that I do like that I discuss in my article is one by James Stock at Harvard and Spencer Reeder of Vulcan Group. And also in 2016, they analyzed different levels of a coal consumption royalty adder, essentially just a coal consumption tax that would be applied on the royalty rate for federal coal. Looked at different levels of it, all the way to 100% of that coal externality costs, down to 20%, and they looked at different baseline scenarios. This was important because at the time, we didn't know if we would have the federal Clean Power Plan in place or not. And so that changes their results quite a bit. And this upper example is with no Clean Power Plan, which is actually closest to our present situation. But the main takeaway is that in all of these scenarios, greenhouse gas emissions decrease, in some cases quite significantly, and at the same time, at least for the 20% and 50% of the coal externality cost cases, revenue to the federal government and states increases a fair amount, in fact. And that is revenue that can directly support these communities, ideally in transitioning away from reliance on fossil fuels. So this is just a chart from the stock and reader study. This is a snapshot of Wyoming, and you probably can't see it all the way at the back, but on the far left, this is the kind of base cases where there's no coal royalty rider at all. And then as we move to the right, it shows the effect, the revenue effect of the increasing coal combustion externality adder. So revenue, for example, in this the highest example, no clean power plant and 20% of the total coal combustion cost, states earn up to additional $4 billion a year. So there's other empirical studies out there. I'm not going to discuss these in detail. I'll highlight just one that I did with my colleague Peter Howard at NYU. We wanted to do kind of the counterpoint to the stock and reader study. So we looked at just upstream production externalities, methane emissions from coal mines. This is a tiny percentage of the total externality cost from coal. But we wanted to just look at that. And also we looked at the transportation externality costs from coal production, which is actually quite significant. Other studies were done by the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and then also by Pete Erickson and Michael Lazarus in the room, who instead modeled just directly, what would be the climate change effect, greenhouse gas emission benefit of stopping federal fossil fuel leasing and issuing no more extensions. So, just to sum up, there's certainly room, I think, to consider fiscal reform as an important policy lever, especially where we don't have any sort of comprehensive climate change legislation happening at the federal level. States also, I think, should take a close look at this, and they can use these tools to model what the effects would be at the state level and the international level as well. And there are pros and cons to this approach. It may not be necessarily the fastest one, but the question is, really what is politically feasible? And I think we need to pay attention to the revenue and local community effects, and this could potentially be an attractive solution. Thanks.
So I feel a bit, I guess, thrown in the lion's cage here. From Switzerland, country with no fossil fuels, talking about United States with 3 scholars and 1 moderator who all work on this particular case for a long time. I'll try to give you a bit of a different angle as to not to get too entangled in what the previous speakers spoke about. And I'd like to really speak about basically what's laid out here and how this guy got elected and what coal might have to do with this. So I guess I'm kind of preaching to a converted crowd here. So you all know coal is a big issue. You see global emissions on the left, and you see sort of energy is the large chunk of it, and you see coal is a large chunk of energy. So if we want to decarbonize, coal is certainly crucial. And now we've heard kind of today and yesterday, it's in many instances not economical anymore to run coal power plants, but they still seem to be running somehow. So there is a bit of an issue with that. And a lot of it is due to these lock-in effects. It's a very strong inertia in that sector. It tends to be, energy and overall tends to sort of constitute monopolies and be largely state-owned, be it the land or the company or both. So we kind of need policies both to phase out coal and to phase in alternatives. And interestingly, such policies are actually sort of coming into play. You see internationally the Paris Agreement, for the US, the Clean Power Plan, and there are other examples too. Now, problem with that is there are policies and there is a political effect that sort of comes with it. You see Trump getting elected in 2016 in the United States. You see the famous or infamous by now picture of this conference, Australia in Parliament with a chunk of coal. He is the new Prime Minister in Australia. You see UKIP in the United Kingdom campaigning on the sort of keeping the lights on issue and trying to sort of make the case that coal needs to remain. And last but not least, you see Germany exactly kind of copy of that, to be honest. So AfD kind of campaigning on the same thing, and without coal, lights will go out. So you kind of see at least you see a political backlash. Now, what we wanted to look into is, can we somehow establish that link? So we look at the US, of course. I'll just very quickly go over that. That's basically kind of the literature behind all of this. I think it's not super relevant for this crowd, but focus on the middle here. So the question that we're really trying to address is, how does the decline in coal production affect voting behavior in the US? And there's kind of two arguments in the literature, and one is kind of this really pocketbook voting. So it's kind of, okay, if somebody steals my job or takes away my economic prosperity, I'm going to punish this guy or the incumbent afterwards. And there is the other that is called sociotropic voting, which is more of like a community thing. So if I feel that my community is going down the drain and there is sort of dire future prospects, then I decide to vote against. So we kind of try to figure out which of those is more true. So look at the US. What you see here is always the US and Appalachia. So Appalachia as one of the main coal-producing regions. You see in the first chart, you see production, and you say, well, okay, it's been going down in the US and in Appalachia, but not crazy, right? Now, if you move over, you look at how many coal mines are there. You see, okay, well, there seems to be a bit of a distinction. So in blue, you see Appalachia, and in black, you see the rest. So it's kind of a phenomenon, this decline in coal, that is really quite regionally concentrated if you look at mines. And more importantly, if you look at actual people, then you see there is a really, really distinctive effect. So this is labor hours in coal mines, and this is coal employees. And for both, you see there is really a clear distinction, kind of a trend that is stable for the rest and very much downward for Appalachia. So what we want to do is, you see the years as well. So you see basically all of this happened between 2012 and 2016, so in the second Obama term. So we kind of want to use that empirically, that all of that happened in the second term and then had a potential effect on the election. Now, let's try to connect this to actual sort of voting behavior, and this is still very anecdotal. You see a map of the US, and it's all US counties, some 3,000 counties, and you see the rhetoric gets the larger the percentage change in votes for the Republican Party. It's a bit confusing because the light is actually more Democrats or zero, so I should redo this map. But what is true is the redder it gets, the more Republican it was. It sort of became from 2012 to 16. And you sort of compare this with a map of coal production, and you see all the blue counties are counties that experienced over 50% decline in coal, and you see that's Appalachia here. And sort of anecdotally, you could say, well, there is at least anecdotal evidence that makes this question worthwhile asking. If you go one step further, you look at correlations. You see, okay, each of these counties and how do they correlate? You see GOP is here the vote share of the Republican Party, and you kind of expect this. It's coal production, employees, and labor hours, and all negatively correlated with Republican vote share. So that means sort of the less employees or the less labor hours, the more people vote for the Republicans in these counties. What you also see is that sort of it seems to be less connected to production and more to actual labor. And what's also quite interesting is this is almost one. That's the correlation between the number of employees and the labor hours in these mines. And that kind of means it's not that the labor hours are reduced and these people start working part-time, but they're actually laid off. So if the work hours decline sort of one-to-one with the employee numbers, then it's layoffs. It's not kind of part-time work. So did I say all of what's on the slide? Oh yeah, that's also an interesting thing. Production and labor are not strongly connected, and that's largely due to the fact that you saw also in the previous map, the kind of production decline in all over the US is not that relevant. It kind of shifted to Wyoming, and that's really the thing that you see, the sort of cheaper mining or surface mining in Wyoming took up some of the decline in Appalachia. Now, if we go one step further and kind of try to see, can we causally, or at least I wouldn't make the causal statement yet, but can we like identify an effect? What you see in these two charts, you see two groups of counties that we separated. So the red line is always the remaining counties, and the blue line is the one that are so-called the counties of interest, or the treated counties, if you want to say. In the left panel, that's all the ones that had a production decline between 2012 and 16. And in the right one, it's all these that had a labor hour decline. And what you see on the y-axis is the vote share for the Republican Party. So to give you an impression, so this is, the rest would be some like 2,800 counties, and the ones that are affected would probably be in the range of 300 here. What you see is basically might be a small effect here, but there is not really, I mean, statistically, you don't really see a discernible effect. And that's plotting all so that's, I think, that's Clinton, Clinton, Bush, Bush, Obama, Obama, and then Trump. So that's 7 election cycles. And so that's kind of to say, okay, it doesn't seem to be the decline in coal production that discerns these counties in voting behavior from the others. Now, and that's kind of like, in very abstract terms, that's the pocketbook thing, right? So you lose your job, you lose production. Do you then vote differently? Now, we do another separation, which we call sort of more a cultural heritage effect, where in one set we discern Appalachia from the rest, and in another we discern those counties that in the last 10 years had at least one active mine. So that's basically all the counties that had some sort of a connection to coal. And that's irrespective whether they, between 2012, lost jobs or lost production or whatever, but they have somehow like a more cultural identity, we would argue, because they used to have a mine in their county. And you see there is quite a strong effect. This is the more interesting one, because that is actually irrespective of the region and just looks at those counties that did have a mine. And you see it's sort of the same until the first Obama term, the first Obama election, and then it starts becoming different in the second Obama, when Obama was sort of re-elected, and then when Trump was elected. Now, very quickly, I'll show you a results table. So we do kind of different regressions with this and using different controls. I'm happy to speak about this later, but I mean, what we find is there is about a 4 percentage point effect of this sort of coal history of a county in the 2016 election. So in essence, that's to say, kind of the fears of political backlash, if you do threaten these communities, there might be some truth to that. And what we also find is that you remember sort of 2 slides back, the first charts, and this effect doesn't depend on actual declines in labors or actual declines in or actual layoffs, but it really depends on this more structural or more identical factor of whether there used to be at some point in time a coal mine in that county. There's a bunch of other things. Let me jump to the conclusions. So first thing, there seem to be political effects of phasing out coal. More specifically in the US, the coal counties, that's counties with a coal history, were more likely to vote in favor of Donald Trump in the 2016 elections. And there's evidence that suggests that this is rather sort of a community voting reason behind this, and not so much a pocketbook voting. So it's not so much about the actual economic effect in place, but it's more about the actual sort of cultural identity of that community. And that has interesting policy implications, because that kind of means, okay, what can you do in these counties? Can you just provide other jobs? Is that going to solve it? And that suggests, well, probably not, because it's not purely, or can you transfer? Can you pay them? Can you just pay them off and then they'll be happy again? Probably not. There is also a bunch of open questions, of course, and the interesting one is this one, I think. I mean, in my opinion, whether this effect exists per se or needs to be triggered by a political campaign. It's a very interesting question, I think, that's really open. So I wouldn't make a statement on that yet. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. The main message that I hope you will take away from this is that the U.S. federal government and the California state government have strong and broad authority to stop new fossil fuel development in the United States and in California. I want to start by going back very quickly to the carbon budget from Oil Change International. Thank you so much, Greg, and everybody at OCI for this wonderful work, building on the existing carbon budget literature and showing in a really clear and simple way that there's already enough carbon in open producing oil, gas, and coal fields globally to blow way past 1.5 degrees. So to stay below 1.5, we need to close most of the existing open producing fields before they're fully depleted, and there's no room for anything new. The United States is the largest producer of oil and gas. It's the second largest producer of coal, and we have massive remaining fossil fuel reserves. Generally, fossil fuel development is going to be under the control of either the federal government or a state government, and I'm going to talk first about the federal government and then say a few words about California. The federal government retains ownership over massive amounts of fossil fuels. It holds those in trust for the public, and they get developed when the government decides it's going to sell them off to fossil fuel producers. And so far, the government has auctioned off only 10% of what it owns. But the fossil fuel emissions from just that small slice are enormous. So over about the past decade, about a quarter of US fossil fuel emissions can be traced back to these federal leases. So this is why the US government needs to stop selling off the new stuff. There's no room for anything new. There's certainly not room for that 90% that the government still owns, and absolutely no reason to sell it and make it available to development in the first place. Once those fossil fuel rights are sold, it's more difficult, not impossible by any means, but it's more difficult to prevent them from being developed. So this is why hundreds of NGOs filed 2 legal petitions to the Obama administration in 2016 asking that Obama stop leasing and stop selling off the new stuff. There's 2 petitions because there's 2 different legal regimes, one for the offshore oil and gas and the other for all the onshore fossil fuels. And offshore, there is a law called the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. Onshore, it's a little bit more complicated. The statutes are different, but they're both similar in that fossil fuel development is a staged process. So first, the fossil fuels have to be made available to be sold, then they have to be sold, and then the government has to approve exploration and development plans and development permits for them to be extracted. Under OXLA, the offshore law, there is a explicit phrase that allows the president to withdraw any and all fossil fuels at any time from leasing. It's very simple. Presidents from Eisenhower to Obama have done it. There is no question about the legal right of a president to withdraw. What's getting fought out right now is whether that withdrawal is permanent or not, because the Obama administration, at the end of his term, withdrew large amounts of the Arctic and the Atlantic Oceans from leasing. Trump came in, summarily reversed that, and so my organization and others are in court fighting about that now. I think we will prevail, but regardless, there's no question that the president can always withdraw. Onshore, oil and gas development happens under multiple laws, the Minerals Leasing Act, the Federal Lands Policy Management Act, and there's not the same explicit withdrawal clause, but it's similar in that the Resource Management Agency has to make the fossil fuels available for leasing in what's called the Resource Management Plan. And they have no obligation to make anything available for leasing. If it is made available for leasing, they may, but they don't have to hold lease sales. And to its great credit, the Obama administration also issued a moratorium on coal leasing. And so what they said was we need to look at some of the fiscal issues that Jayni was talking about, but also the climate impacts of leasing all that coal. And they said we need 3 years to do this study, and in the meantime, coal leasing has to stop to avoid locking in large amounts of coal extraction. Once again, Trump came in, overturned that. Once again, we're in litigation to reverse his overturning it. But we will also see what happens there. In both onshore and offshore, after the leasing phase, you have multiple more steps for exploration and development and permitting and environmental review requirements at each of those stages. And in the absence of further positive action from Obama and any positive action of any kind from Trump, NGOs are suing over virtually every stage in the process to block new development and seek to fully enforce all those environmental review requirements. In California, we have had 5 years of no leasing, 5-year moratorium because of legal victories overturning leasing and planning decisions for not looking at the impacts of fracking. And a comment period just closed on the Trump administration's attempts to reopen leasing in California. And many dozens of NGOs commented that there should be no leasing because of the climate harms. And interestingly, California Governor Jerry Brown and a host of California management agencies also commented to Trump, said there should be no leasing because federal leasing in California is incompatible with California meeting its climate targets and the Paris climate goals. And it is great that Governor Brown wrote in and said this. It's very important. This argument is not just coming from NGOs, it's also coming from the state of California. But it is a little bit ironic because Governor Brown is willing to tell Trump to do the right thing, but he's not willing to do the right thing himself. California is a top oil producing state. It is a little known but very important fact that 3/4 of our oil is more carbon intensive than oil from the tar sands of Alberta, Canada. Our governor is known as a climate hero, but he has approved more than 21,000 new wells in California. And it is under state law that the California governor has discretion to approve or to deny each one of those permits. No fossil fuel operator has a right to receive a permit. It was his decision to issue these permits, and in fact, he ignored environmental review requirements, which say you must look at all the harms of this permit and rubber stamp the permits instead of doing a good, solid analysis and concluding, as one must, that you cannot issue a permit for a new well in California because of all the climate harms. More than 800 organizations have called on Brown to show real climate leadership by ending the issuance of permits for new wells and fossil fuel projects, for ending neighborhood drilling, putting in a health buffer and shutting down the existing wells near where people live, work, and go to school as soon as possible, and then committing to a thoughtful plan to phase out existing extraction with support to the workers in the communities that are most affected. Brown convened Global Climate Action Summit with the stated purpose of raising ambition to meet the Paris climate targets. And we called on him to do these things for the exact same reason that he asked Trump not to lease. Because without these things, California climate policy is not complete and it's not successful. Unfortunately, Brown hasn't done these things. We called the campaign the Brown's Last Chance campaign because it was his last chance to be a real climate leader and to make California climate policy a model worth following. And that is why many of us were outside the Global Climate Summit a couple weeks ago in San Francisco protesting Brown's failure to act. And I agree with the other speakers here who have said this doesn't need to be that complicated. It's actually quite simple. All of our leaders need to stop approving new fossil fuel projects. If they don't, they will be met with massive civil society protest. And so the next time that the president or the governor of California tells you that they'd love to do something for you, but they just can't because they don't have the legal authority, please do not believe them. And for all of the details, please see our conference paper. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Guri Bang from Cicero in Oslo. I have a question for Florian. Or first, I would say thanks for those great presentations. It was fascinating to hear from you all. But I have a question for Florian. What I thought about when I heard your presentation was that the communities that actually do the coal mining are quite few. When you look at that map that you showed with the GOP, GOP communities, or GOP voting, and then the coal communities. So I was thinking, have you considered looking more broadly on the consequences of coal, the coal industry in the US, in terms of including, for instance, the electricity sector, and perhaps also other elements like the service industries or the coal trains or the other elements that are important for bringing coal from the mine to the actual power plants. So thanks.
Hi there, this is a question for Kassie. With regards to California, I think one of the sort of internal logics that the governor's office gave as to why they didn't move forward on reducing production was the idea that they would poke the oil beast by doing so, and so that they would instead focus on demand, because that would be the thing that would give them the most in the long term without really riling up this sort of political space. I'm not sure I buy that particular logic, but I'd be curious as to what your response is to that sort of thinking. Yeah, thanks.
Did you have a question?
This is a question for Ali. And what changed? Early for many years, it seems the Obama administration's approach was to focus exclusively on demand side, and then there was a shift towards the end. How did that come about? What were the factors?
So why don't we tackle those three first? And Florian, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Yeah, great question. I think, there's definitely scope to widen the analysis. I'll give you very quickly three reasons why we focused on the mining and thought that is particularly important. The first one is most of the political campaigns are on the mines. So the political movements or parties that do campaign on that quite specifically. Trump holds up, Trump digs coal, and he doesn't hold up, we burn coal for electricity. So it's quite specifically on the mining, and that's due to the fact that historically, but still now, most jobs are in the mine. So if you compare, I don't know exactly about transportation. I think that's an interesting avenue. But if you compare mining to electricity plants that burn coal, for example, you see that mining is much more labor intensive. And then regarding the number of counties, it's actually from a purely empirical point of view, it's quite nice that it's not that many. So it's roughly, it's a bit less than 10% of all counties. And it's quite nice for this method. So we don't actually look for a phenomenon that is very, very widespread in the US, because the counterfactual or your control group is quite powerful if it's that large, because you can kind of build a very similar set of counties out of the rest. Yeah, so it's kind of three reasons that led us to this. But I'd be happy to talk about the transportation, because I think that's an important, like these coal trains might be an important factor also that influence voters.
I'll take the question from Alex. I'm so glad that you asked that. That is indeed exactly what the governor says. I can't get anything done if I take on the oil industry. And it is the exact same thing that we've heard my entire professional career. In the 1990s, we heard it from the Clinton administration, and they went to Kyoto and they said the only way we can proceed with the United States participation is to do this market trading. It's the only way we will get the polluters on board. And then the rest of the world accepted that in Kyoto, and the US reneged on it. We heard the exact same thing from the Obama administration. They said, we cannot take on the polluters. We must move to the right. And by moving to the right, we will minimize the political backlash and we will get things done. We have to go slow now to go fast later. That's what we've been hearing from the Democratic Party in the United States, and we heard the exact same thing from Governor Brown. And I didn't agree with it in the 1990s, but what we can say now is that it has been proven false. Obama would not do what needed to be done on climate out of fear of political backlash. And now we have Trump in the White House. And this is why we are so hard on Governor Brown, and why we do not, in one of the richest places in the world, we don't have any more time or patience for this argument, because it's simply failed. And I can't prove to you what's going to work, but the move to the right in the United States is not some accident. It is a result of billions of dollars by far-right fossil fuel interests that have poured this money building the Federalist Society that's right now trying to get Brett Kavanaugh onto the Supreme Court. And we're not going to win with the same strategies that have failed for 30 years. So that's why we have to change it, and we're out of time.
You asked what changed during the 8 years of the Obama period. First, I want to just make sure we populate the things that happened on the sort of first 4 years. So, work on mountaintop removal, changes to the leasing plan relative to the 5-year offshore leasing plan that had been done under the previous administration. So there were steps being taken, I think, during the first 4 years that maybe weren't elevated as much and as visible. So that's, I think, thing number one. Number two, there were a lot of data gaps. There continue to be data gaps, and I've spoken to that. As you sort of heard the progress, for example, on the coal side with Jayni, if you looked at the studies and when they were done in like 2015 and 2014 and 20. And there were studies that were done before then too, but there was a lot of scholarship and data that became available that was useful for decision making. The third is, the option set changed. I remember standing on the South Lawn the day Waxman-Markey cap and trade passed the House of Representatives. Not the Senate, but the House of Representatives, which now seems like a fairy tale land that something like that would happen. But we were vigorously pursuing a legislative, comprehensive climate policy. And after Waxman-Markey did not succeed in the end through the Senate, we came back again with a clean energy standard in 2011 to try to pursue that. So, the first term was really a number of runs at a legislative solution. When that opportunity appeared to be foreclosed in the second term, I think there was a stronger evaluation of what the executive option tool set looked like. And regardless of how much, not discredit any of my panelists, regardless of how much you discount the legal analysis here, it's hard to walk away from the facts to suggest that there isn't some significant amount of discretion afforded to the executive. Now, how much you breathe into that is up to your analysis, but it's hard. There are very few people who say there isn't some significant amount of discretion. And there are a lot of people who say there's a lot of discretion. So, regardless of where you fall on that, if you're in a place where your option set's been constrained, you go to public lands, and that's an opportunity. And the last is that I'll just say is just advocacy was, the environmental community became, I think, really sophisticated about advocating on this issue and advocating in a way that was resonant with some of the governing principles around the management of these resources. Principle among them was the fiscal argument, which I think was very resonant with sort of the career civil service, the folks who spend time thinking about this on the Hill, folks in the States, and I think the advocacy there really paid off. So I think the top line is, I don't think that much changed, but what changed was definitely a result of elbow grease, some necessity, and improved data and analysis.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Let's do all three of the hands that are up.
Hi, it's Ben Frana from Stanford. This is a question for Kassie and anyone else who has thoughts on it. I was just wondering, with regard to moratoria on leasing these public assets, are there any analogies or precedents, just the sorts of arguments that could be made to try to just win that argument, to just shut these off so that we're not entirely dependent on a friendly administration?
I don't want to pick on Florian. I appreciate having an outsider perspective on our politics, but you talk about coal phase out, and I want to clarify that the decline in coal employment, particularly in Appalachia, is not from primarily environmental or climate policy. That has a little bit of factor, but it's about cheap natural gas. And so if we're thinking about our political theories and the kind of approaches we want to take, we may have political backlash regardless of whether it's our intentional policy or change in markets as we think about how to kind of advance these issues moving forward.
Thanks, great panel. So the supply of carbon emissions on U.S. public lands is dominated by fossil fuels, but emissions from the land sector are large, and in the context of a changing climate growing, particularly in the context of fire. And the projected growth is pretty dramatic, particularly in places like Alaska, where the fires are also warming the soils, which have permafrost under them, lots of methane as well as carbon. It's a pretty unpleasant picture. And I'm curious to know whether any of you or your organizations are paying attention to or thinking about what are the levers we can pull in the context of a net zero goal to incorporate carbon into fire and land management on public lands in addition to the fossil supply.
Hi, Pete Erickson, Stockholm Environment Institute. My question is for Ali, and I guess I have quite a bit of a hard time understanding why it's so complicated and why you're saying the data is so complicated. I mean, Interior knows what it leases. It knows how much carbon is in each ton of coal. There you go. There's the CO2 emissions, and you know that you have the resource management plan or other mechanisms as Kassie described, even if you don't believe you have all the authority that Kassie described. So why is it so complicated?
So why don't we take why don't we just take them in order?
So if I'm understanding Ben's question correctly, it's that, so we know that if a president wanted to do this, they could, but can NGOs force them to do it even if they don't want to do it? Is that, yeah. So I alluded to one piece of that a little bit, which is that NGOs are just suing over every fossil fuel leasing and development decision to try to stop it. In this current comment period where Trump took the first step to reopen leasing in California, which is the planning stage for onshore development, we actually said in our comments not only that they shouldn't lease, which the state of California also said, but in fact, they can't legally lease because under the Federal Lands Policy and Management Act, the main primary duty before you get to the balancing part that others have been talking about is you have to protect those federal lands and resources. And you simply cannot protect them from climate disruption if you keep leasing and opening up new carbon for which there's no room in the budget if we're going to maintain, a planet that we recognize and limit warming. So there's definitely lots of thinking about that. It is harder to force the government to do something. They have lots of authority to do lots of things. To make them do lots of things is harder, but I think that the science and the situation is really developing such that we will start winning those kinds of arguments.
So maybe picking up on, unless anyone wanted to add to that, picking up on Peter's question then about land use change and as a supply for CO2, if folks have been doing any work on that.
I have some couple thoughts, unless anybody wants to go first. That's a really, really important question, and for a long time, we and others have been thinking about this and pushing these land management agencies to be thinking about how you manage in a warming world. And it's a very complex issue. I would say, I guess just to pick out one really big example, one thing we can't do, for example, is embrace false solutions like biomass energy that are actually more carbon intensive at the smokestack than coal and that require, will lead to massive biodiversity and landscape damage, and which is actually happening because of a lot of policies that we have on the books. So that's one big one.
I take my moderator hat off. I'd just say I'd love to follow up with you a little bit. I mean, Wilderness Society has been thinking about carbon as a leading indicator of restoration opportunities when looking at both transition jobs programs and then just the restoration work that's needed, especially across the Intermountain West, both for fire, pre-suppression. I'm getting the sign, yeah. So why don't we just end with the question for Ali? Why is it so hard?
Great. Why is it so hard? Land sector is actually a great example of why it's so hard. So that is one place where I think we could all acknowledge that we have significant data challenges, not only on what is the impact of the new stressors, but we spent a lot of time talking to Chase about how do you structure a land management policy that maybe does take steps towards being net zero, and it's challenging to really do a good fulsome accounting. But I think Oxford's done some work on this, others have as well, with sort of ubiquity of sensors and autonomous systems and the ability to crunch the data. I think we could get there faster than we imagined we would before. I think the complexity is what is the thing you're trying to solve for. I think if there is a neatness to setting zero on the other side of the equation and solving for the variables, and if you decide you're gonna sort of that the carbon budget determines that your leasing policy is going to be that you don't do new leases or that you can't go past a certain amount. I think that adds a lot of clarity to how you approach it. I will concede that point. If you live in a world that's politically constrained and you've got a bunch of other competing priorities like healthcare and keeping the economy back on track and winning elections and so on and so forth, then maybe you remain unbending and you continue to do that, or you try to find some other point at which you're comfortable. And the place where I think when I speak of the data challenges, what I was really focused on is how do you do a more sound accounting rather than set a clear end objective. So the principal focus was how do we do a more sound accounting of what are the costs, what are the benefits, what are the feedback effects, What are the improvements that need to happen? How will maybe production shift elsewhere? And when you take into account all of those variables, and what you're doing is process change rather than outcome change, then it becomes a lot more complicated.
Yeah, and Florian, why don't we connect you and Amy when we finish? Because I've been informed we're done here. But to wrap up real quick, I mean, the important takeaway here, I think, is everybody at this table is an ally, right? And we've been working in the U.S. to try to advance policy. We've made a lot of progress. The discretionary authority and the tools we were using allowed for a lot of backsliding, which we're experiencing right now. So there's work to do in coming up with new tools. But there's this inherent tension between the need, the necessity of moving quick, and what's thought to be politically feasible. And you know, that challenge has been a difficult one to overcome, and I'm sure it's not unique to the U.S. But appreciate you sitting and listening into the lessons that we've learned from our experience. Thank you.